Civil rights movement we shall overcome. The civil rights movement that I'm going to be discussing in this lecture is the one that took place in the 1950s and 1960s. And it pertained primarily to African Americans. The civil rights movement was about African Americans seeking equality for themselves. It was about challenging segregation, violence, and discrimination that had long been perpetrated against African Americans, not just in the South, but in the northern and western areas of the U.S. as well. The civil rights movement initiated an effective change through the courts, legislature, and civil action. Your objectives for this lecture are: describe the civil rights movement that occurred in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s, and describe the lives of African Americans at the time of the movement's leadership, strategies, methods, and themes used in the repeal for civil rights. First, let's talk about de facto segregation in the North. De facto segregation means segregation by custom or tradition, not by law, like the Jim Crow laws in the South. We have talked about migration of blacks to the urban cities in the 1920s due to violence and inequality in the South. After World War II, many whites moved to the suburbs. For example, we discussed Levittown, Pennsylvania in a lecture of the 1950s. Levittown, Pennsylvania was a planned community with cookie-cutter houses and safe neighborhoods. It was considered a safe place to live and raise a family. After World War II, the GIs were raising families thanks to the money from the government through the GI Bill and also through FHA loans. Remember, we had this rise in consumerism and class status in the 1950s. African Americans remained in the cities, living primarily in poverty. African Americans were subjected to employment discrimination, doing menial jobs for low wages. They were not getting professional jobs despite skills or education. They also had to pay high rents. They lived in what was referred to as ghettos. After the whites left the cities, the neighborhoods were not being well cared for by the city governments. This is referred to as white flight. When the whites moved to the suburbs, they took their money with them. And many whites moved from the cities because of the influx of both African Americans and immigrants. They felt that their property values were being devalued because of that influx. They looked at African Americans specifically as criminals. Levittown was known to be a white neighborhood only. During the 1950s, there is an attempt to change the status quo in Levittown. What I mean by status quo is only white people living in Levittown. When a family by the name of the Myers moved to Levittown, Pennsylvania. The Myers moved to Levittown with their 3 kids. William Myers was a veteran working as a lab tech and was going to college to become an engineer. But when they moved to Levittown, tensions soon arose. I'm going to show you a small clip from a sociological study that took place not long after the Myers family moved into Levittown. It became what was known as a crisis in Levittown. So the sociologist interviewed residents of Levittown. This will give you a sense of discrimination and how whites in this neighborhood viewed blacks.
A new suburban community of 60,000 people midway between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey. With its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees, it is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. In August 1957, Levittown, Pennsylvania attracted international attention when violence erupted as William Myers, Jr. and his family moved into the three-bedroom house at Daffodil and Deep Green Lane. In almost all respects, the Myers family is close to the Levittown norm. They have 3 small children, the youngest only 1 month old. Myers served for 2.5 years in the Army and was discharged as a staff sergeant. He works as a laboratory technician and is studying for a degree as an electrical engineer. His wife, Daisy, is a college graduate. The Myers home is modestly furnished, and their late model family car was bought on time. They are very close to the Levittown norm, except in one respect. William Myers, Jr. and his family are Negroes in an all-white community. Some view the incident calmly and indicate acceptance of the fact. But for others, the Myers moving into Levittown constitutes an infringement of their own liberties.
And we understood that it was going to be all white. We were very happy to buy a home here.
How about your children? Have you talked with them about the Myers?
We have tried to keep the discussions away from the children. I feel that it's something that we adults should solve without bringing the children into it any more than we have to. We're doing it for the children, but I don't feel that they are old enough to understand the problem as it is.
Do you think a Negro family moving here will affect the community as a whole?
Definitely.
In what way?
I think that the property values will immediately go down if they are allowed to move in here in any number.
And what of the dream of middle-class respectability? If a Negro family can afford what you can afford, how do you justify your feeling of superiority? What other objections, aside from the effect on property values, do you have against the Myers?
He's got 3 children, and evidently he feels that they will be accepted socially. And I don't feel that they ever will be. But the whole trouble with this integration business is that in the end, it probably will end up with mixing socially. And you will have, well, I think their aim is mixed marriages and becoming equal with the whites.
Do you intend to move?
At the time, no. It's a pretty impossible situation. We have our home here, and if the colors move in and run real estate values down, there are a lot of us, the GIs particularly, who are going to be more or less with their home.
So as you can see, this was really about white superiority. That they felt that if the Myers moved into this neighborhood, that somehow made them equal to whites. Here's another clip.
You're aware that a Negro family has moved into Levittown.
Yes, I heard about it.
What was your reaction?
Dynamite. Dynamite.
What have you done about it?
Well, I guess we just discussed it.
How do you feel about the Myers moving in?
Well, I'm very definitely against it.
Before coming to Levittown, did you have any contact with Negroes?
Well, I came from a small town where we didn't have any colored people. And at that time I had, I had no feelings either way. So while we were waiting for our house to be built, we lived in Trenton for 9 months. And, that was my first contact with them, both in work and going through colored sections to work. And I was very happy I was moving into an all-white community.
Have you ever discussed the Myers at home with your children?
Never before in our house was anything mentioned, pro or con, about colored people, because I feel that they have to be in contact with them to a certain extent, and why should their minds be prejudiced? But since they have moved here, they have heard remarks, and, I'm afraid to say I'm going to dislike the idea. There were colored children in the school my son attended last year for the first time, and he often came home and said there had been trouble between them during the day at school.
It becomes convenient to exaggerate one's own fears and to help a neighbor increase hers.
My boy, he likes sports, and he used to go down there every Saturday with a few of the boys from the neighborhood. And there was an argument that occurred, something real silly. My boy and a colored boy got in an argument. Well, from that time on, for the whole remainder of the summer, the boy was afraid to get down there because the colored boys got a gang together. And every time they would get near my Jimmy, they would beat the devil out of him. I went to the principal and everything about it.
A major factor is fear. Fear of economic loss, loss of status, fear of violence, and fear of intermarriage. Do you think other Negro families will come to Levittown?
Definitely.
Yes.
What do you think will happen?
Well, just what's happening already. I don't know. It's a rumor I read in the paper where they have 2 colored school teachers now in Levittown. So that's just a good example of what is going to happen.
What's wrong with that?
I do not like it. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. And if there's too many colored people around here, I definitely will get out. I'm not thinking much. I don't want her associating with colored people, period.
Well, I'm very definitely against mixed marriages, and that's eventually what it's going to come to. If children are raised together, they're not going to think of anything of marrying together.
Well, I just could not live beside them. I don't feel that they should be oppressed. But I moved here. One of the main reasons was because it was a white community.
The concerns amongst many of the white residents was that their homes were going to be devalued. There was going to be violence because African Americans were perceived as criminals. They were running in gangs, as this one woman mentioned. There was this fear of interracial marriage. And my favorite line from this segment is, I don't think they should be oppressed or anything, but I just don't want them to live in my all-white neighborhood. So while this type of de facto segregation is going on in places like Levittown, Pennsylvania, we still have the segregation going on in the South. If you remember, we talked about Jim Crow laws, and that is still alive and well in the South by the time you reach the 1950s. There were separate schools, restaurants, drinking fountains, public transportation, parks, etc. Whites in the South are getting better jobs. blacks are getting low wage jobs, such as domestic jobs or sharecropping. Blacks had limited voting power. There were still literacy tests and poll taxes. They had what was referred to as white primaries or white only elections. In the South, there was still violence, lynchings. And with respect to lynchings, I want to show you an example of what was going on. There was an incident involving a young 14-year-old black boy. His name was Emmett Till. He was from Chicago, and he was visiting his uncle in Mississippi. I'm going to provide you the clip to what happened to Emmett Till, but I want to just describe briefly what happened. While he was in Mississippi visiting his uncle, he went into a store, was what was perceived as boasting about having interacted with white women, and he said something to the effect of "bye baby" to a white woman in the store. Shortly thereafter, two white gentlemen took him from his home, or his uncle's home, rather, and they murdered him. One of those men was the husband of the woman that Emmett Till spoke to in the store. The two gentlemen were put on trial in front of an all-white jury in a segregated courtroom and ultimately found not guilty. Two of the gentlemen that murdered Emmett Till admitted to doing it to a news reporter later and felt justified in doing it. Emmett Till's mother opened her son's funeral to the world. She wanted everyone to see what had happened to her son. And why that's significant is because, a funeral is a very private event. It's something very personal to people. And for her to have the courage to open up to the world, to let the world know what was happening in the South, was pretty remarkable. And also remember, we have television in the 1950s, which we didn't have prior to that. So it's one thing to hear about lynchings and murders of black people happening in the South, and it's entirely something different to see it with your own eyes, at least see the effects of it. So I want to make sure that you watch that clip, and I will put that on campus. So African Americans had been fighting violence and segregation, discrimination since Reconstruction, which we discussed in the earlier Civil Rights Movement lecture. You remember, there was Booker T. Washington, who was in favor of industrial or vocational education to help lift blacks out of poverty and to fight discrimination. We also discussed Ida Wells and W.E.B. Du Bois. Remember, Du Bois had founded the NAACP. He made speeches, petitioned the government, wrote journal articles, etc. And we also had Marcus Garvey, who had started the Black Separatist movement in the 1920s. He was part of the United Negro Association. If you remember, this was where he felt that African Americans couldn't get a fair shake and should leave the United States. While all of those efforts were important, they were not as effective as the change that resulted in the 1950s and 60s civil rights movement. So, what made this movement possible? The answer is the influences of World War II and the early Cold War. Attitudes towards fighting racism overseas influenced attitudes fighting racism in the 1950s and 60s. In other words, the US was fighting fascism and Hitler and Nazism. They were fighting the oppression of the Jewish population. And that's something that's going to be brought up in what was called the Double V campaign. African Americans pushed for victory abroad and at home. So African Americans who were also in the military fought against fascism and racism abroad, and they were fighting for it at home. During the Cold War, there was desegregation of the military by President Truman in the 1940s. Also during the 1940s, the baseball player Jackie Robinson played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. He broke barriers as not being part of a segregated league, which had been how baseball was designed in the past. They had segregated leagues, but Jackie Robinson broke that barrier. You will see the rise of the African American entering into the middle class. African Americans were attending college, some thanks in part to the GI Bill. Many civil rights leaders will come from the African American middle class. They will become attorneys and ministers. There is more media exposure on television, like I just explained to you with the Emmett Till case, which exposes violence being perpetrated against African Americans. Civil rights advocates will use the court system, the legislature, and civil action to advocate for change. They work within a white-driven society. It's not just about uniting as a race. They had to persuade whites. And one of the ways that they did that was through a court case called Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. The advocates used the Equal Protection Clause from the 14th Amendment as a basis to argue for the end of segregation. What had happened was a young black girl wanted to go to an all-white school. So this case was brought before the Supreme Court, and ultimately the Supreme Court ended segregation. It overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. Now this case specifically referred to the schools, but what ends up happening is it has a ripple effect with respect to segregation in other areas, such as transportation. It will set a precedent to eventually end segregation pretty much everywhere. There is a backlash to this ruling. One of the backlashes that we've already talked about was the Emmett Till case. Emmett Till murder came after Brown versus Board of Education. But another backlash was in Little Rock, Arkansas, the Little Rock Nine in 1955. 9 black students tried to enter into Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. Central High School at the time was an all-white high school. The governor of Arkansas, whose name was Orval Faubus, sent the Arkansas National Guard to prevent the black students from entering the school. And mind you, this was very violent. There was all kinds of names being yelled at the black students. There were rocks being thrown. There was pushing and shoving and just all out resistance to desegregation. So Eisenhower, who was president at the time, sent federal troops to escort them into the school because the governor was also resistant to desegregation. And there would be a continued refusal to honor the desegregation ruling. In other words, desegregation didn't happen overnight. And the governments in other states would also ignore this new ruling by the courts. This is a photograph of Faubus, who was resisting desegregation in Arkansas. Another way that civil rights advocates fought for the rights of African Americans was through civil disobedience. Martin Luther King Jr. was a minister who formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. He and the conference joined forces with the NAACP. And he and the NAACP believed in what was referred to as a nonviolent philosophy towards resistance, civil disobedience. And there were a number of different types of civil disobedience that took place during this time period. One was sit-ins. This is a picture in Greensboro, South Carolina, at the Woolworth's Five and Dime lunch counter. And sit-ins like this happened all through the South. And what a sit-in was is where a group of people, in this case primarily young black college students, would sit at the lunch counters all day. And then they would have another group come in and sit at the lunch counters. And these lunch counters were all white counters. So the idea was to send a message and disrupt the businesses, right? To show that that they're not going to tolerate being treated any differently. There was also demonstrations and marches and pickets. This is a picture of the biggest march, which was on Washington, but there were others in other parts of the South, specifically Selma, Alabama. There were freedom rides. Young whites and blacks rode on interstate bus lines, such as trailways, for example, through the South. And it was organized by CORE, or the Congress of Racial Equality. And often these buses were met with violence. They were attacked by the KKK. There was fire bombs thrown at it. There were people being pulled off buses and beaten. So it was very, very violent and very dangerous to do this. And there was also boycotts, such as in Montgomery, Alabama, by Rosa Parks, who refused to sit at the back of the bus, organized, or at least helped organize a boycott, And what this boycotts do is they interrupt business. They show these bus lines that African Americans are an important part of their community, that primarily African Americans rode buses to work, and without them, then they would hurt the bus system financially. So finally, in 1964, Congress will pass a Civil Rights Act, along with the help of LBJ, who was president at the time, Lyndon Baines Johnson. This act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission to prohibit job discrimination. LBJ was a Southerner and a former Senate Majority Leader, which gave him a lot of political clout. Remember, this is right in the heart of this resistance to desegregation. So, LBJ, being a Southerner and helping promote the Civil Rights Act, was a big deal. In fact, he made a lot of deals to get the Civil Rights Act passed, but he did so because he felt it was important. Even though the Civil Rights Act was passed, the Civil Rights Act did not include voting rights. So there will be continued marches by civil rights advocates to get voting rights, such as the one in Selma, Alabama in 1965. The Voting Acts, the Voting Rights Act will be passed in 1965, and what the Voting Rights Act did was it outlawed literacy tests and other ways that prohibited people from registering to vote, specifically blacks. And then finally, in 1965, there was a 24th Amendment which outlawed poll taxes in all federal elections. This is a photograph of the march in Selma. This was a march advocating for voting rights. It's important to understand that although the Voting Rights Act was passed, some of the Voting Rights Act was recently struck down by our current Supreme Court. Specifically, Section 4. Section 4 said that certain jurisdictions had to get federal approval before changing their voting laws. It was specific states in the South. The court said that there was no longer a need for Section 4, that there was more equality in the South now, and that they didn't need to have an oversight. And naturally, a number of civil rights advocates were very concerned about this because voting is a very important part of democracy. So that was a concern when we started requiring voter IDs, or when we have this what's referred to as an exact match system. Those are the concerns that people have when we start placing these laws, because these laws are ideally intended to suppress the vote in some form or fashion. Okay, so I'm going to turn to a different part of the civil rights movement. I'm just going to mention them briefly, but it's important for you to understand them. This gentleman, his name was Malcolm X. Malcolm X was not necessarily in favor of civil disobedience. He believed in more of an abrupt change. Do what you need to do by any means necessary, which is very opposite of civil disobedience. You also had the Black Panthers, who were a militant group who kind of took that any means necessary to heart. He believed that Martin Luther King's method of civil disobedience was too slow, that this was not going to happen gradually, that there needed to be an abrupt change, and it needed to be done through militant means if necessary. Which is interesting because it's somewhat similar to what W.E.B. Du Bois said, but not in the same, quite in the same way. He didn't advocate for militant or violence behavior, but he did believe that it needed to be an abrupt change. So in some ways, although the NAACP was more associated with civil disobedience, some of these origins can be seen in his Doyle's kind of early thoughts about how to make change. There they are again, Black Panther Party. Eventually, you're going to see riots in places like Watts because they were protesting police brutality of African Americans. And I want to end this lecture by sharing a personal story of mine. I grew up in Arkansas, and during the late 1970s, like around 1979 into 1980, my school was desegregated. My school district was desegregated. And I have to tell you, as a young kid, I never realized how much my school district was segregated. It's not something that I really even thought about at the age of 11. But what had happened was that there was a part of the school district that was not being funded. It was actually an all-black community, and the school was a community school in that community, and their schools were not being taken care of very well. There was broken windows, there was poor playground equipment, old books. You know, it really was being defunded or underfunded by the school districts. In my school, I had air conditioning, I had nice, up-to-date books, nice classrooms, nice playground equipment, and so forth. But it was something that was necessary, and it was something that the school district had fought for a number of years. So the point of this is to tell you that just because we have laws, we have Supreme Court rulings, doesn't necessarily mean people's attitudes change. That there's not still school districts that are being underfunded. We may call it something else, but it's still happening. I've had students in my other classes that have said, you know, as late as or as recent as the 2000s, their school district was very segregated. So segregation was outlawed in the 1950s, and the desegregation of my school district didn't happen until 1979, just to give you an indication of that. So always be aware of that. All right, so this ends your civil rights lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know.